Today on the podcast, we continue our story of screenwriter Larry Watkin and Walt Disney as the Disney studio moves into live-action production in the 1950s. I'm often asked, who was the real Walt Disney? And typically I answer that, just as with most people, there were many versions of Walt Disney. Walt, like all of us, changed and grew over time. The 60-year-old Walt, who was interested in family comedies, the expansion of his theme park, and the use of film to help audiences understand cultures from around the world, was a very different person from the 30-year-old Walt, who was focused on developing 6-minute cartoons, working with a small team of people whom he largely considered his friends. In terms of our story today, I look at it this way. Later in his life, such as when Disney filmed Mary Poppins, Walt would go out of his way to give the director significant creative control over production. Walt would also pointedly stay away from the set during filming. Even when Irwin Costell, the composer for Mary Poppins, directly asked Walt to visit a recording session, Walt politely refused, explaining that he didn't want to be the type of studio head or executive producer who interfered with the creative work of others. But back in 1951, Walt was less sure of his and his studio's abilities with live action. This slightly younger Walt Disney wanted more control of the early live action features, and that is part of the story that plays out in today's episode. Last week our episode was focused on the first Disney live-action offering, which was Treasure Island. And this week we'll focus on the second offering, a film that was eventually released under the title Robin Hood and His Merry Men. As you've probably already sensed, our story today is not only about how Walt and Larry Watkin created live-action films, it's also about how Walt Disney Productions as a company expanded from a mid-sized studio to one that also developed films and experiences that reached far beyond animation. These live-action films are one of the key steps that moved Disney from a company focused on cartoons and animated features to one that produced live-action TV entertainment and was interested in developing multiple theme parks. This is one of the steps that connects the early studio to the large Disney organization that we know today. So, if you're ready, here we go. Screenwriting with Walt, Part 3. Treasure Island was, in ways, a surprise hit. It demonstrated that Disney, what had previously been a mid-size animation studio, might now compete with more traditional studios who released multiple live-action films each year. It changed the trajectory of the company. It also opened more doors for Larry Watkin. With the film's success, Watkin found that other studios were interested in hiring him and increasing his salary. "Well, I weighed the matter carefully," he said. "I knew that at Disney's I'd remain as anonymous as a medieval monk." He also knew that nearly all attention for a Disney production went to Walt, but he decided to stay at Disney's as he now believed that Walt possessed a synthesizing genius, probably a higher form of creativity. Walt was more approachable than other producers. Beyond this, Watkin liked the material that he was assigned. He understood its scope and direction. To put it simply, he was now part of Walt's inner circle, and he liked that role. Once Treasure Island was finished, Walt and Watkin knocked around ideas for another live-action feature. Initially, they wanted to build on the success of Treasure Island, casting both Bob Newton and Bobby Driscoll in another period drama. Filming on this feature would, of course, need to start after March 1951, when Bobby was 14 and legally allowed to work in the UK. In particular, Walt wanted another film with Driscoll, as he was under contract with the studio. And as a child actor signaled that this new film would also be arranged for a family audience. By now, Watkin understood both Walt's tastes and his strategy for conceiving high-cost features. At times, he felt he understood Walt's thoughts better than other artists who had worked at the studio for years. One afternoon, Leo Sulkin, a storyman who worked with animation, asked Watkin if Disney was ever going to do something original in live action. Watkin explained that Walt was drawn to well-known stories because they helped sell a picture, not just in live action but in animation. Walt was still gun-shy about original stories being the basis for a feature after losing money on some original projects back in the 1940s. When you don't trust your own judgment, you stick to the classics, Watkin explained. That's why he does things like Snow White, Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Treasure Island, and even... Then Watkin waited for a second before naming an animated short that Sulkin himself had adapted from a popular short story, Pigs is Pigs. Watkin then leaned a little toward Sulkin and in a slightly softer voice said, "They're pre-sold." Sulkin nodded his head as though he understood some new aspect about the big boss. After he lost his ass on Fantasia, Watkin continued, he doesn't trust his judgment. He doesn't want to have to go to those damn bankers again. Damn near lost the studio to him. But Watkin also suspected that with these live-action projects, Walt was rebuilding his confidence. If he produced a line of successful pictures based on classics and well-known figures, he might branch out more into original projects or at least projects that had original elements. Eventually, Walt decided to produce a live-action version of Robin Hood. The familiar figure of Robin Hood would sell the film. Initially, Walt wanted to veer away from familiar legends so as to include both Bobby Driscoll and Bob Newton. It was easy to place Bob Newton into the film. He could play the role of the bombastic but lovable Friar Tuck, a somewhat self-absorbed religious figure who joins up with Robin Hood's men. Placing Driscoll in the picture was a little more difficult. At one point, a story was imagined around a young boy played by Bobby Driscoll who hung around Robin Hood's camp. But eventually, Walt decided to create a straight adaptation of the legend of Robin Hood, a story that had been told in many previous Hollywood features. With this more traditional story, Bobby Driscoll was loaned out to other studios to work on non-Disney features, but Bob Newton was still on board to play Friar Tuck. The story idea of Robin Hood had circulated at the Disney studio for over a dozen years. One of the first references to this story was back in April 1937 for a cartoon short featuring Mickey. Story notes from that year describe it this way. Mickey dreams he is Robin Hood and has to rescue Minnie from Pete. Almost surely, this story was proposed as a comic satire of a large-budget live-action film of Robin Hood featuring the charismatic and athletic star Errol Flynn, then being filmed at Warner Brothers. Disney never created that Mickey Mouse short, but if it had, it almost surely would have found a large audience as a light satire of the Warner Brothers feature. With production cost at $2 million, The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn was the most expensive film Warner Brothers had ever released up to that time. Also, its first using the 3-strip Technicolor process. That 1938 film was largely a stunt spectacular, with endless rebels battling Prince John's soldiers. The script was arranged as a love story between Robin, played by Errol Flynn, and Maid Marian, played by Olivia de Havilland, a couple who had previously appeared with strong chemistry on screen in Captain Blood and The Charge of the Light Brigade, both made by Warner Brothers. They were also rumored to have an off-screen romance, even though Errol Flynn was married, a romance that producers were hoping would help sell the 1938 version of Robin Hood. As one of the first live-action features filmed anywhere with the 3-strip Technicolor process, the costumes for that 1938 version of Robin Hood were extremely bright and unusually clean, as though the merry men living in the forest put on new clothes before each scene. In terms of color and presentation, these costumes were nothing like clothes worn in England in the 12th century. The exterior shots for that film were filmed in the foothills just outside Sacramento, among golden brown fields dotted with California oaks, a terrain that looked nothing like the actual Sherwood Forest. Everyone in the film spoke contemporary English, mostly with American accents, which further distanced the film from its source material. But the on-screen chemistry between Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland was strong. The color presentation was new and captivating, and the stunt sequences were uniquely choreographed and spectacular. The Warner Brothers film took in $4 million at the box office, making it the sixth most successful film of 1938. The film won Oscars for art direction, film editing, and musical score. It was also nominated for Best Picture. Based on the film's initial success, Warner was able to re-release the title in the 1940s, which increased its overall profit. The success of this film created a unique situation for Disney, who now in 1951 wanted to produce their own live-action version of the story. Disney secured two possible titles for their picture: The Story of Robin Hood and The Story of Robin Hood and His Merry Men. Technically, these titles would separate the Disney effort from the film produced by Warner Brothers, but everyone knew that once the Disney film was released, most theaters would simply put Robin Hood on the marquee out front, just as they had with the Warner Brothers title. With luck, theater owners would add Disney's, but still the title was likely to cause confusion among filmgoers. Roy Disney, who managed business affairs for the company, repeatedly heard that studio heads over at Warner Brothers felt a resentment that Disney, an animation studio, was working on their second live-action feature, which would focus on a topic that had been presented in one of Warner Brothers' most famous and most expensive films, even though that 1938 production now showed its age, particularly with its highly saturated color. Disney understood that their film, though relying on the same Robin Hood legends, would need to create a unique vision of the story to clearly differentiate their offering from the Warner Brothers film. This job, like many others, fell to Larry Watkin. Under Watkin, the Disney script would be focused on research and historical realism, whereas the Warner Brothers film had gestured more to stunts and romance. The Disney version of Robin Hood would also reuse well-known aspects of the popular legend featured in the Warner Brothers film, including the bridge battle with Little John and the archery contest. But these stories would be directed at different narrative goals, whereas the Warner Brothers film leaned at times toward fantasy adventure. Watkin wanted to create a script that held the illusion of a believable 12th century drama. In the Warner Brothers film, the central attractions were the romance and the stunts. In the version arranged by Watkin, the central attractions would be believable drama surrounding political intrigue between King Richard, Prince John, and their mother. Prince John's desire for power created a situation whereby Robin robbed government officials to buy food for the poor. This was a bookish approach to a screenplay, one more focused on the motivation of individual characters than on visual spectacle. Another of Watkin's central concerns was the dialogue. He wanted the language to sound as though it were tied to the 12th century, though of course authentic Middle English would be impossible for a contemporary audience to understand if spoken. He needed to find a way to frame contemporary English so it pointed to a much earlier period. "I think I polished the dialogue," he said, "down to where it sounds antique without being difficult to understand either side of the Atlantic." Similar to the Warner Brothers film, the Disney offering would present well-known episodes from the legend of Robin Hood. But in Watkin's mind, these segments now needed to be connected with more than just title cards. For this, he explored how this story, with all of its transitions and isolated episodes, might have been told during the time of Robin Hood. Specifically, He looked to the figure of a traveling minstrel who would set up each narrative sequence with a song. Watkin penned ballads suitable for one voice and a stringed lute. For inspiration, he turned to text he had once assigned as an English professor. "There are ballads I used to teach at Washington and Lee. Stood me in good stead," he said. "I believe mine sound authentic without rambling." To ensure that the finished script held notes of authenticity, he spent months in England. He visited the Robin Hood caves. Those in Nottingham Forest he found to be sandstone and crumbly. But another set used by the Merrymen in Yorkshire have stalactites and stalagmites, similar to caves Watkin had known back in Virginia. When the script was finished and approved by Walt, even before a director was hired, it was handed off to the art director Carmen Dillon. It's possible, in fact likely, that Walt saw this as part of an overall strategy to manage development control of the picture. If Walt directly oversaw work of an art director, much as he did with an animated feature, a director once brought onto the project would be given a mostly complete vision for the film, one that went back to Walt as organizer rather than to the director. Carmen Dillon had focused much of her career on screen adaptations of Shakespearean plays. 3 years earlier, she had won an Oscar for Hamlet. 2 years before that, she had been nominated for Henry V. Now she recreated 12th century England with an eye toward historical accuracy, a role that required her to work closely with designers at the Denham studio. One studio rep explained they didn't have cups or forks in the 12th century, and people used a hunting knife to cut their roast and joints. Everything was checked, even to the coat of arms in the Great Castle Hall scene. With the cinematographer, Dillon mapped out each scene shot by shot, which included camera angles, following the exact storyboard structure Disney used when developing an animated feature. The process of storyboarding the movie before a director was hired not only allowed Walt more control, it also allowed him to engage the planning through visual documents. By this point, Watkin understood that Walt was a deeply visual person. To tell the truth, Watkin said, not one of the famous studio heads, including Walt Disney, at first could react to a screenplay. They had to see the film, then they knew. But Watkin also understood that Walt was trying to teach himself how to develop a film largely through text. Disney was one of the few that ever learned to judge the written page, Watkin added. But at this point, Walt wasn't quite to the point where he trusted development without visuals, especially after some post-production missteps while editing Treasure Island. Along with art direction, Disney also oversaw casting at a distance. With this project, Pierce assumed a larger role in helping Walt select actors. The leads filmed screen tests in England, which were then sent to Walt in California. At the top of the list of people to play Robin Hood was Richard Todd, a 31-year-old British actor who was then becoming somewhat of a matinee idol both in the UK and in America. A film test for Todd was shot in England, then sent to Walt for review. The film tests arrived the first part of the week, Walt wrote, and we looked at them. I think Todd is wonderful, and I feel he will project a great deal of personality and do a lot for the role. Bill Anderson, a producer at Disney, would later add that Walt liked his happy-go-lucky attitude, his natural look. Despite the positive test, initially, Todd wasn't keen on this role, as he felt that people would compare him, perhaps negatively, to the version of Robin Hood played by Errol Flynn. He was shorter than Errol Flynn, also less athletic. I thought of myself as a serious actor, Todd explained. I didn't see myself scampering around in Lincoln Green. But then he talked to his American agent on the phone. For God's sake, he said, do it. It's going to be a very, very big picture, and it's going to capture a huge audience who will be your audience for the next 30 years. Once Todd understood that the production would be more of a historical drama than a historical spectacle, he agreed to take the role. For the romantic female lead, Perce Pierce was directed to find a young British actress, perhaps someone relatively unknown, who suggests the countryside but is also aristocratic. Dozens of girls were considered for this role, but eventually it went to Joan Rice, a 21-year-old newcomer who 2 years earlier had been employed as a waitress. A screen test of Rice was made at Denham Studios in full costume and sent to Walt in February. After seeing it, he directed Pierce to hire her. The selection of a director was handled in a similar fashion, with Pierce acting as Walt's emissary in England. The team identified a British director named Ken Anakin, who was then finishing work on Hotel Sahara at Pinewood Studios. Perce Pierce was already in London, and as Pinewood was only 20 miles away, Walt agreed that he should make first contact to discuss the possibility of Anakin directing Robin Hood. The two men met in Pinewood's dining commons, where Pierce explained that after Treasure Island, Disney planned to make a live-action version of Robin Hood. Anticipating some of Anakin's objections, Pierce admitted that it would be the 14th time that the story was brought to the screen, with the most famous version being the 1938 Warner Brothers film with Errol Flynn. "It's gonna be far less corny than all the previous versions," Pierce said, "and truly based on the old legends and historical records." Anakin was somewhat interested, particularly as the project would be arranged with American big budgets and Hollywood know-how. In short, the film would allow him to have higher production styles than with Hotel Sahara. Yet he wanted to talk it over with his friend and producer Sidney Box to make sure a connection to an American company or to the family-focused Walt Disney Productions wouldn't have a downside for future projects in England. After listening to the offer, Box said, "Go for it, old boy." Anakin understood the limitations of this project, yet was irritated by them all the same. Much of the casting, including the leads, had already been done, as had the visual planning. "The first time I ever hit the storyboards was Robin Hood," Anakin said, "where the storyboards had been done before I was engaged, which I didn't especially like. I mean, at the outset, it seemed to me I was being put in a straitjacket of someone else's creation." Anakin understood the lay of the land. Walt, who was still new to live action, wanted more control as the picture would be shot thousands of miles from his studio. Even though Walt would visit the set a few times as part of a family vacation and a business trip, he needed assurances that the production would adhere to Disney values. Shooting sketches had been made in England by Carmen Dillon, whose work Anakin loved, and then Walt in California returned them with notes. "At least 50% of the reason for working this way," Anakin said, "was to enable Walt to exercise control and supply his creative input from 6,000 miles away." Anakin understood the trade-off. He wasn't creating a Ken Anakin picture. He was creating a Walt Disney picture. But in return, he'd direct a film far more elaborate than any on which he'd previously worked. Initially, he worked to fill gaps left by Walt, including finalizing shooting locations outside of Denham. This would allow the film to have at least some of his creative fingerprints on it. He liked Watkin's script and quickly understood that Watkin, as a writer, wanted to arrange this picture as the most historically accurate version of Robin Hood. That's how this film would differentiate itself from the many previous screen versions of the material. Watkin was very, very anxious that the story should keep as close to the legend as possible, Anakin said. "When I came on, everyone wanted to shoot it in the historical setting of Nottingham Forest, but we had far better woods around Denham." With this, and likely with Walt's approval, the production team began to dress additional stage areas at Denham Studio for the film. At the time, Denham Studio had 4 sound stages, including 2 massive structures, each over 200 feet long. One of those structures would be dressed as the Nottingham Castle, complete with drawbridge and moat. The other was dressed as Robin Hood's camp in Sherwood Forest. Another problem concerned the last-minute replacement for the Friar Tuck role. At the start of 1951, Disney still believed that Bob Newton would play Friar Tuck, thereby creating an on-screen connection with Treasure Island. But this plan appears to have fallen apart quickly. Disney never commented as to why Newton was released from this role, but it may have to do with a scandal in his personal life. In February 1951, Newton, separated from his wife, moved to America to work in Hollywood pictures and took their 4-month-old son, Nicholas, with him. One day after his departure, his wife accused him of taking their son without her permission, essentially of kidnapping him. "Oh, it's all rubbish," Newton said. Also, he insisted that his wife knew about the arrangement with Nicholas. While in America, he hired a nurse to care for the child while he worked on set. But related or not, by the following month, Disney was recasting the role of Friar Tuck in England. For decades, Disney had complete reputation control over its characters on screen, such as with Mickey Mouse. But now the company struggled to manage the personal lives of actors and how they might or might not affect how the public viewed the characters they played on screen. In this, Disney was just starting to grapple with PR issues that had plagued other studios for years. Anakin believed that a British actor, Jimmy Hayter, with whom he had recently worked, might be good in this role. A year earlier, Anakin and Hayter had both worked on a film called Trio, which collected visual adaptations of 3 Somerset Maugham short stories. Hayter, who had starred in one of these stories called The Verger, screen-tested for Friar Tuck on the same day that Walt Disney first visited the set, which made Anakin nervous. Not only was Anakin meeting perhaps the most famous studio head in Hollywood for the first time, he was also being watched as he helped Hayter find his voice and mannerisms for the role of the jovial monk. Pierce, as always, accompanied Walt around Denham and stood beside him as they together watched Hayter's screen test. Anakin joked with the actor a bit, trying to bring out some of his natural good humor that would be essential to the role. During a break, Walt introduced himself. "You seem to have a very laid-back relationship with your actor," he said. "Well, we just finished a movie together," Anakin replied, "and we're exploring how much joviality we can get away with in this role of the hard-drinking battling monk." Walt nodded his head, considering this. "He can be played several ways," Walt said. "I've always seen him quite clearly in one way." Then Walt took a seat on a plaster rock, something that Friar Tuck might sit on in the actual scene. "I see the character something like this." Walt's face then changed, as it often did when he play-acted, until it held the amused but firm demeanor of the character. Much to Anakin's amazement, Walt began to act out a scene where Friar Tuck talked to an imaginary Robin Hood. Walt knew the lines by heart, Anakin said. Some of the crew gathered around and applauded him, which he acknowledged with a wave. Walt then nodded at Anakin, indicating he was off to look at some recently completed sets. "Carry on, Anakin," he said. "I'll speak with you more when I've seen the Verger and the rushes of these tests." In the days that followed, Anakin traveled with Walt to visit outside locations, specifically castles in the Midlands that might be used for establishing shots. Most of these castles had been damaged 3 centuries earlier in battles between England, Scotland, and Ireland. The damaged spires could be easily put back in the picture by matte painter Peter Allen Shaw. But Anakin could see that Walt was upset by the damaged castles. He liked things to be tidy, Anakin observed, and just as he had imagined them in his dream. On their journey, which included shooting locations for the forest scenes, they talked about Walt's early years, the creation of Mickey Mouse, and the making of Snow White. "I knew he was a very special man, perhaps a genius," Anakin said, "but now I saw a determination, obstinacy, and consciousness of budget, which clearly went back to his tough, early self-made beginnings." These discussions more than confirmed that Walt wanted his vision of Robin Hood, not Anakin's vision, brought to the screen. Anakin felt reasonably sure that he could deliver on that. He also sensed that if he performed well with this assignment, there might be other Disney projects in his future. From this, he could see how, and more likely why, Walt wanted control. He had a clear and unified vision for the film. He was also concerned about budget. Arranged from this angle, Walt's interest in planning seemed more practical than anything else. At Disney, Pierce told Anakin, we have found it's much more sensible and cost-effective to invest the time and salaries of 3 or 4 artists at a drawing board discussing, sketching, and exploring the best ways of telling a story, rather than wasting time doing it on the set or location. It's unlikely that Pierce mentioned that one of the key problems for Treasure Island had been the cut he'd assembled of the film while in England, and that this type of pre-planning would minimize the mess that he or anyone else could make of a film in an editing bay. The cast and crew were often surprised by how deeply Disney had visually planned for this production. At each meeting, a sketch artist was present, Richard Todd recalled, and as each camera setup was worked out and agreed, he produced a pencil and wash picture of exactly what would be in the camera lens. These sketches were photographed and bound into folders, and all of us at these meetings were eventually issued with the bound volumes showing every single camera shot. By this point, Anakin also understood that aside from story planning, there were deep financial advantages to storyboarding a film. No set was built that wasn't actually used, one actor observed, because the scenic designer knew exactly what the camera angle was going to be. So if there was a wall that was never shot on, the wall wasn't built. Though Walt would eventually give directors more individual freedom, as this was his second live-action film, he wanted to approve nearly everything that would appear on screen, right down to costume selections. When Pierce sent photos of the actress playing Maid Marian in costume, Walt wrote back, I still worry about the costume for the girl. She's very attractive when her hair is done as in the Page costume. As actors moved before the cameras, and as the first set of press stills emerged from the production, the controversy about the Disney versus Warner Brothers films was picked up both by the trades and in syndicated columns. One reporter, Dorothy Kilgalene, put her confusion this way. Can you figure out why Walt Disney is spending $1.4 million to make another version of Robin Hood in England when there will never be a more dashing Robin Hood than Errol Flynn? In a separate set of articles and interviews, a Disney spokesperson responded typically by pointing to Watkin's research. The difference, as one Disney rep put it, is based on an enormous amount of historical research, which makes it correct in fact and detail down to the last arrow. By the time the team was ready to film, Anakin had found his place with the Americans from Disney. He even liked Perce Pierce, who had mostly irritated Byron Haskin while shooting Treasure Island. Anakin, however, could see both the limitations and strengths of Pierce's nature. It just happened that Walt picked out a man who was prepared to, like himself, find other talent and make that talent come together, give them an exciting enough job. Perce Pierce was essentially Walt's mouthpiece in England, that much was clear. Even though Anakin was more accepting of Pierce than Haskin, he did have his limitations. On the first day of shooting, Pierce set up a chair not far from that of Anakin, as though the two in this arrangement had equal power. He sat there almost surely, with the brown felt hat in his lap, as the production crew set up the first shot. My temperament is such that I could not, and never have been able to, work with the feeling that someone is looking over my shoulder, Anakin said. Pierce quickly got the message. By the second day, he was upstairs at the studio in an office where runners let him know how the day was progressing on stage. Pierce was able to have his say the next day when we saw the rushes, Anakin said. And once that routine was established, Anakin got along just fine with Pierce, as together they began work on Walt's second live-action feature, one that, like the first, would be created thousands of miles away from the Disney studio. I'll be back next week with a new episode. I know I mentioned this last week, but I thought I'd point it out again. If you're interested in how Walt expands the studio in the early 1950s, we have another 4-part series over on Bandcamp that follows Walt and the Disney studio through these same years. At the Disney studio, Walt had different concurrent work groups. Larry Watkin and Percy Pierce formed the work group that developed the early live-action features in England. During these same years, though, Walt had a second work group that looked for ways to create what we would now call early animatronic scenes. Animatronics would, of course, show up later at Disneyland, but during this period, before Disneyland, Walt had a very different vision for what animatronics might do. He wanted to create an elaborate show that would tour the country. The materials of that series intersect very closely with the materials of the series that we are now doing, Screenwriting with Walt, right down to the trips to England. So if you're over on Bandcamp, you can find that series as a 4-part album called Ken Anderson and the Origins of Audio Animatronics. It runs about 2 hours. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes that are not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly supporter at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I will also leave that link down in our show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.